A man is ordered to retreat through a jungle that eats armies alive. His troops are starving, sick, hunted from the air, already written off by London as a lost cause. And yet, a few years later, the same man will command the force that breaks Japan's grip on Burma and turns humiliation into one of the most unlikely reversals of the Second World War. The twist is that he doesn't begin as a born aristocrat, or a cavalry hero, or a polished empire officer at all. He begins as a clerk's son with a stammer, a scholarship, and a quiet fury at being underestimated. His name is William Slim, and the clock starts ticking long before the world learns it. He is born on 6th of August, 1891 in Bishopston, near Bristol, into a family that knows the weight of money because it doesn't have much of it. His father works as a commercial traveler. The household is respectable, but never secure. Slim grows up watching adults calculate every purchase, every train fare, every pair of shoes. It leaves him with a lifelong instinct. Waste is not a moral flaw, it's a threat. Later, when men are dying for lack of transport, lack of quinine, lack of food, that instinct will harden into doctrine. At school, he is bright, but not effortlessly so. He reads widely, writes, thinks. Yet he is not the kind of boy the British Army traditionally selects for greatness. He has a stammer. He is not tall in the heroic way. He is not from the right clubs. He learns early that charm can be a weapon and that self-control is a shield. He also learns something else. If you want a door to open, you may have to build the door yourself. He studies at King Edward's School, Birmingham, and then at the University of Birmingham. He is not drifting, he is climbing. He takes a job, he teaches. He tries to make himself useful in a world that rewards pedigree. The future at this point is supposed to be modest. A career, a family, a quiet life. Then Europe catches fire. In August 1914, the war arrives like a sudden storm that turns every plan into paper. Slim joins up, commissioned into the Royal Warwickshire Regiment. He is not a romantic about it. He is practical. The army needs officers. He can lead. He will go. But the Western Front is not a place that rewards good intentions. It is a machine that grinds men down into mud and numbers. He goes to Gallipoli in 1915, one of the war's most brutal lessons in what happens when courage is asked to compensate for bad planning. The landings, the cliffs, the heat, the flies, the stench of bodies that cannot be buried properly. This is not the clean war of newspapers. Slim is wounded there. The injury is not just physical, it is educational. He watches how quickly confidence collapses when supply fails, when orders are confused, when leaders cannot see what their men are living through. He stores those observations away like ammunition. He returns to service and later goes to Mesopotamia, another theater where the enemy is not only human but environmental. Heat that bakes the brain, rivers that flood, disease that spreads faster than any battalion. Slim is wounded again. Twice wounded before he is even 30, he learns a truth that will shape him. Survival is not luck. It is preparation, discipline, and the ability to keep thinking when fear is loudest. By 1918, he has risen through experience rather than privilege. He earns the Military Cross, but medals are not what he carries home. He carries the memory of men who did what they were told and died anyway. He carries the smell of hospitals. He carries the knowledge that war is not won by speeches. It is won by systems, training, supply, morale, leadership that does not lie. When the war ends, Britain exhales and tries to forget. Slim does not. He stays in the army. For many, that choice would be a comfortable glide into peacetime routine. For Slim, it is another uphill climb. The interwar British Army is small, underfunded, and deeply conscious of class. Slim is competent, but competence is not always enough. He must become undeniable. He transfers to the Indian Army, an institution with its own hierarchies, its own politics, its own contradictions. India is not a posting, it is a world. Slim learns languages, studies cultures, watches how soldiers from different backgrounds respond to different kinds of leadership. He learns that respect is not a slogan, it is a daily practice. He also learns that the empire's confidence is brittle. It looks permanent only because people keep saying it is. He marries Aileen Robertson in 1926, and the marriage becomes one of the quiet anchors of his life. Slim is not a man who performs emotion for an audience, but those close to him know the depth of his loyalty. He is building something stable because he understands, perhaps better than most, how quickly stability can be taken away. Professionally, he keeps moving. He attends Staff College at Quetta, a place that turns officers into planners, into thinkers who can move divisions on maps and make logistics feel like strategy. Slim excels not because he is flashy, but because he is honest about what war actually demands. He is not seduced by elegant theories that ignore mud, hunger, and exhaustion. He is the kind of officer who asks relentlessly, and how will the men eat? How will they sleep? How will they move? What happens when it rains for a week? In the 1930s, the world begins to tilt again. Japan expands in Asia. Europe grows tense. Britain, still scarred by the last war, hesitates to imagine the next. Slim watches the hesitation with a soldier's impatience. He knows what unpreparedness costs. He has seen the bill. Then in 1939, the Second World War begins. Slim is no longer a young lieutenant proving himself. He is a seasoned officer with a mind sharpened by 2 decades of study and service. He is sent to East Africa and then to the Middle East. The war is global now, and the British Army is stretched thin, improvising, learning in public. In 1941, Slim is involved in the campaign in Iraq and then in Syria and Lebanon, fighting Vichy French forces. These are not the headline battles that fill cinema screens, but they are complex operations. Political, logistical, morally tangled. Slim's reputation grows. He is calm under pressure, clear in his orders, attentive to the reality on the ground. He does not waste lives to look bold. He does not pretend that setbacks are victories. Men trust him because he does not insult them with fantasy. But the real test, the one that will define him, waits further east, where maps turn green and the air itself feels heavy. In late 1941 and early 1942, Japan strikes with terrifying speed. British and Commonwealth forces in Malaya and Singapore collapse in a shock that feels like the end of an era. The myth of invincibility shatters. The Japanese advance into Burma, and suddenly India itself seems exposed. Slim is sent into this unfolding disaster. He takes command of Burma Corps, Burr Corps, at a moment when the situation is already sliding toward catastrophe. The enemy is aggressive, skilled, and confident. The roads are few. The air belongs to Japan. The monsoon is coming like a closing fist. And behind Slim is the weight of expectation and blame. If Burma falls, someone will be held responsible. If the retreat turns into a rout, the stain will be permanent. Here is the time limit that matters. The monsoon. Once it breaks, movement becomes misery. Rivers swell, tracks vanish, vehicles sink, disease blooms. If Slim cannot pull his forces back in time, back toward India, back toward supply, back toward some kind of defensive line, his army will not merely be defeated, it will be swallowed. The retreat from Burma in 1942 is not a single march. It is a long, grinding unraveling. Units are cut off. Bridges are blown. Refugees clog the routes. Families carrying bundles. Children barefoot. Old men collapsing by the roadside. The heat is punishing. The jungle is not scenery. It is an enemy that hides ambushes and drains strength with every step. Men go down with dysentery, malaria, exhaustion. Some simply sit and cannot be made to stand again. Slim is in the middle of it. Not as a distant signature on orders, but as a presence moving among shattered formations, trying to keep coherence where coherence is dying. He has to make decisions that feel like betrayal. Abandon equipment, abandon positions, sometimes abandon the idea of holding Burma at all. Every mile back is a wound to pride. Every day is a race against encirclement and collapse. And there is another pressure, quieter but just as lethal, the British Army's own habits. For years, many officers have believed that jungle warfare is a sideshow, that real war happens on open ground. Training has been inadequate. Doctrine is stale. Some commanders still think in terms of neat lines and tidy supply columns, as if the jungle will politely allow it. Slim is fighting Japan, yes, but he is also fighting the inertia of his own institution, the deadly comfort of old assumptions. He watches men who have never been taught how to live in the jungle try to fight in it. He watches units panic when they are cut off because they have been trained to believe that being surrounded means being finished. He watches morale crack under the constant pressure of air attacks and infiltration. And he realizes something with a cold clarity. If the army does not change, it will keep losing. No matter how brave its soldiers are, the retreat becomes a crucible. Slim's leadership is not about pretending the situation is fine. It is about keeping the army from dissolving into frightened individuals. He pushes for discipline, for order, for the simple routines that keep men human. Food when possible, rest when possible, clear instructions always. He learns which officers can be trusted and which cannot. He learns which units hold together and which need rebuilding from the inside out. By the time the remnants reach India, the physical toll is visible like a bruise across an entire force. Men are gaunt, boots are shredded, faces are hollow. The psychological toll is worse. The sense of being beaten, of being chased, of being inferior. The Japanese have not only taken ground, they have taken confidence. And yet in that wreckage, Slim sees the raw material of a future victory. He has watched the enemy up close. He has watched his own army fail in specific, fixable ways. He has felt the monsoon's deadline pressing on his back and survived it. He has learned in the hardest possible classroom what must change. The world at this moment does not see a coming reversal. It sees Burma lost, India threatened, and a British general associated with retreat. But Slim is not finished. The story is not about how he fell back. It is about what he builds next, because now he knows exactly what kind of war this is, and exactly how little time he will be given to reinvent an army before Japan comes again. The retreat spits Slim and what's left of Burr corps into India like wreckage thrown onto a shore. Men stumble in with eyes that don't quite focus, uniforms stiff with sweat and mud, feet wrapped in rags where boots used to be. The newspapers can dress it up as withdrawal, but everyone who was there knows the truth. They were hunted. And in the British system, being hunted is forgivable only if you can prove you learn faster than the enemy. Slim is promoted anyway, because the war has run out of perfect candidates. In May 1942, he takes over 5th North Corps, and almost immediately the job reveals its real shape. He isn't being asked to command a neat formation on a map. He's being asked to stop a psychological infection. The Japanese haven't just taken Burma, they've planted an idea in Allied minds, that the jungle belongs to them, that being cut off means being finished, that the British and Indian soldier will always crack first. Slim can feel that idea moving through units like fever. He also feels the clock. It isn't a date on a calendar, it's the next Japanese push. India is not supposed to be a battlefield, and yet the frontier is thin, the roads are few, and the monsoon will soon turn everything into a swamp again. If he cannot rebuild an army before the enemy returns, there will be no heroic last stand. There will be a collapse that reaches into Assam, into Bengal, into the imagination of the empire itself. Slim's first enemy is not Japan. It's the old reflexes of his own side. Officers who still think jungle fighting is a dirty sideshow. Staff who treat sickness as bad luck instead of predictable attrition. Commanders who believe morale is something you lecture into men rather than something you feed, train, and protect. Slim has no patience for it. He has seen what happens when theory meets leeches. He begins to change the culture with a bluntness that surprises people who mistake his calm for softness. He insists on training that matches reality. Patrolling, ambush drills, living off what can be carried, moving silently, learning. To fight when visibility is 10 yards and the air is thick enough to drink. He pushes the idea that being surrounded is not a death sentence. There is no such thing as a cut-off unit, becomes the new creed, because in the jungle everyone is cut off. The question is whether you panic or you fight. Then comes a shock that makes his reforms non-negotiable. Disease. Malaria is not a background inconvenience in Burma and Assam. It is a weapon that kills without noise. In some formations, men are dropping out faster from fever than from bullets. Slim treats it like an operational emergency. He enforces anti-malarial discipline with a severity that feels almost personal, because he knows what happens when an army starts. To believe sickness is inevitable. He makes commanders responsible for the health of their men the way they are responsible for ammunition. If a unit's malaria rate climbs, it is not unfortunate. It is failure. This is not popular. Nothing about rebuilding is popular. But Slim has learned that comfort is a liar. He visits units, talks to soldiers in plain language, and refuses to pretend. He tells them the jungle is hard, the Japanese are good, and the only way out is to become better. He does something else that is rarer than any tactical trick. He makes men feel seen, not as expendable pieces, but as the actual instrument of victory. It's a small shift in tone that becomes a massive shift in belief. In late 1942 and early 1943, the war in this theater is still a story of frustration. The Allies attempt limited offensives into Arakan on the Burmese coast, and the Japanese respond with the move they love most: infiltration. A slipping around flanks, cutting supply lines, appearing behind you like ghosts. British and Indian units, trained for a different kind of war, react the old way. Fear of encirclement, fear of being behind the lines, fear that the map has betrayed them. Positions crumble not because men are cowards, but because doctrine tells them that once the road is cut, the battle is lost. Slim watches this and decides to make a demonstration out of it. When the Japanese surround an Indian brigade at a place called the admin box in early 1944, an ugly little patch of ground that becomes famous precisely because it shouldn't, Slim refuses the traditional response. No retreat, no desperate breakout. He orders them to stay put and be supplied by air. It sounds insane to officers raised on the religion of the road. But Slim understands something the Japanese do not fully grasp yet. Air supply, if you can protect it, turns encirclement into a trap for the encircler. The admin box holds. The surrounded troops fight, dig, ration, and endure, while aircraft drop food and ammunition into a shrinking perimeter. The Japanese, expecting panic, instead find themselves starving in the jungle, their own supply lines stretched and harassed. The psychological spell breaks. For the first time, a Japanese encirclement fails decisively, and the lesson travels through the army like electricity. You can be surrounded and still win. By then, Slim's responsibilities have expanded. In 1943, he becomes commander of 14th Army, the force that will later be called the Forgotten Army, because Europe consumes the headlines while these men fight in heat, mud, and anonymity. 14th Army is a patchwork of British, Indian, African, and other Commonwealth troops, spread across a front that feels endless. Slim's job is to make it one organism. He does it with relentless clarity. Simple plans, hard training, honest communication, and a refusal to waste lives for appearances. But even as he builds, the strategic picture tightens. In 1943, the Allies create Southeast Asia Command under Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten. Mountbatten is charismatic, political, a man who understands theater. Slim is the opposite, a soldier who understands mud. Their relationship will be functional, sometimes tense, often complicated by competing priorities. Mountbatten needs boldness and visible action. Slim needs time to prepare properly. And time is the one resource he never has enough of. Because Japan is preparing something too. In 1944, the Japanese launch Operation Yugo, a massive offensive into India aimed at Imphal and Kohima. It is not just a military plan. It is a gamble designed to shatter British prestige and ignite rebellion. If the Japanese can take Imphal, they can threaten the plains of India. If they can take Kohima, they can cut the lifeline to China. The stakes are not a few miles of jungle track. The stakes are the idea of British control in Asia. Slim's army is about to be tested at the edge of its endurance. The Japanese come on with speed and confidence, moving through terrain that seems designed to protect them. They cut roads, ambush convoys, and try to repeat the old pattern: isolate, infiltrate, terrify, collapse. And now Slim has to prove that his reforms were not peacetime theory. He has to prove them while the enemy is inside India. The battles of Imphal and Kohima become a nightmare of supply and survival. Roads are choked, bridges are blown, and the monsoon looms again. Always the monsoon, that seasonal guillotine. Slim's formations are stretched, and the temptation to pull back is enormous. Retreat would be understandable. Retreat would also be fatal because it would restore the Japanese myth. Slim chooses a different kind of risk. He shifts forces by air. He uses the sky as a road. This is where the war turns into something almost surreal. Entire divisions are flown from one sector to another in a desperate logistical ballet. Aircraft land on rough strips under threat, unload ammunition and food, and take off with wounded men packed tight. The air becomes a bloodstream. Slim's insistence on discipline, on units holding their ground even when cut off, suddenly makes sense to everyone. The jungle is still brutal, but the army is no longer mentally defeated by it. The Japanese, meanwhile, are bleeding themselves dry. Their supply system cannot sustain the offensive. Men begin to starve. Disease hits them too, and they have fewer medicines, fewer aircraft, fewer ways to evacuate the sick. They fight with ferocity, but ferocity cannot replace rice. Slim understands this and refuses to be baited into reckless counterattacks. He lets the Japanese spend themselves against prepared positions, lets hunger and exhaustion do their work, and then strikes when the enemy is weakest. Imphal holds, Kohima holds. The Japanese offensive collapses into retreat. This time their retreat, through the same kind of terrain they once used as a weapon. The visual reversal is almost poetic. Japanese soldiers, gaunt and staggering, leaving equipment by the roadside, dying not in glorious charges but in the slow, humiliating arithmetic of logistics. Slim does not celebrate. He has seen too much to romanticize suffering. But he knows what this means. The initiative has changed hands. And with that shift comes a new kind of pressure. Winning a defensive battle is one thing. Turning it into liberation is another. Slim now has to do what seemed impossible in 1942. Go back into Burma, not as a fleeing commander, but as the man leading the return. The political and strategic demands intensify. China needs supply. The Americans want results. The British want Rangoon. Everyone wants something, and Slim's army is the instrument expected to deliver it. He begins planning the advance with the same obsession that saved him before. Supply, movement, morale. He knows the jungle will not forgive improvisation. He also knows the enemy is still dangerous. Japan has lost the offensive, but not its ability to kill. Slim's challenge is to keep his army aggressive without becoming careless. To push forward without repeating the arrogance that helped him lose Burma in the first place. By late 1944, 14th Army is moving. The men who once staggered out of Burma now march back toward it. Leaner, harder, trained for this exact nightmare. Slim has forged them into something the Japanese did not expect to face. An army that can live in the jungle, fight in the jungle, and most importantly, believe in itself there. And yet the most dangerous moment is still ahead, because the next phase will demand not just endurance, but audacity. To retake Burma, Slim will have to cross great rivers under threat, outmaneuver an enemy that still knows the ground, and race the monsoon again, always racing the monsoon. Because if the rains catch him at the wrong time, the jungle will do what it has always done. It will try to swallow the army alive. The map says Burma, but what Slim is really staring at is a countdown. Not a neat printed deadline, something worse. The monsoon, that annual wall of water that turns roads into rivers and rivers into monsters. If he's too slow, his army will bog down and rot in place. If he's too fast, he'll outrun his supplies and repeat the disaster of 1942. And somewhere ahead, the Japanese are waiting for him to do either. 14th Army begins to move like a living machine. But it's a machine built out of men who still remember the taste of retreat. Slim knows memory can be poison, so he keeps the message brutally simple. We are going back, and we are going back to win. Not with speeches about empire, but with the only currency soldiers trust: food, ammunition, medical discipline, and plans that make sense at ground level. The first test is the kind that doesn't look heroic on film: logistics. Slim's offensive is not a romantic charge through jungle. It's a war against distance. Every mile forward stretches a supply line that can be cut by a handful of Japanese with a light machine gun and patience. So Slim does something that feels almost like cheating. He makes the sky part of the army. Air supply isn't just for emergencies now. It's baked into the plan. Aircraft become trucks. Landing strips become lifelines. Wounded men are lifted out instead of left to die in the green dark. It changes everything, because it changes what impossible means. And then Slim makes his first big, cold-blooded choice. The obvious route back into central Burma runs through the worst terrain and the strongest Japanese positions. The enemy expects him to grind forward, step by step, paying in blood for every ridge. Slim refuses to play the game the Japanese have prepared. He looks for a way to make them fight the war they hate. In early 1945, he aims for the Irrawaddy. The Irrawaddy is not a river you cross. It's a moving barrier, wide and deceptive, with currents that can flip boats and banks that turn into mud traps. On the far side are Japanese formations that still know how to kill, still disciplined, still dangerous. A river crossing under fire is the kind of operation that can shatter an army's confidence in a single afternoon. Slim's answer is misdirection, on a scale that feels like a magician's trick performed with real lives. He lets the Japanese see preparations in one area, encourages them to believe the main crossing will come where it seems logical, where their defenses are thickest. Meanwhile, he shifts weight elsewhere, quietly, relentlessly, moving units through difficult country to strike where the enemy is, thinner and slower to react. The tension inside his headquarters is almost physical. If the Japanese read the feint, if they concentrate in the right place at the right time, Slim's men will be caught on the riverbank, half in, half out, exactly the posture that gets armies slaughtered. And the monsoon clock keeps ticking in the background like a metronome. The crossings go in, boats push off, men crouch low, rifles held above the waterline, faces tight with the knowledge that a single burst can turn the river into a grave. Smoke drifts, artillery thumps. And then on the far bank, the bridgehead holds. Slim doesn't pause to admire it. He drives through it, because the real prize isn't the river. It's what lies beyond. The open country around Meiktila and Mandalay, where movement is possible, where tanks and trucks can finally breathe, where Japanese jungle infiltration loses some of its magic. Slim is dragging the war out of the claustrophobic green and into space. The next move is the one that shocks even people on his own side. He goes for Meiktila with speed that borders on recklessness. Meiktila is a communications hub, a nerve center. Take it, and Japanese control in central Burma starts to unravel. Miss it, and you've thrown a spear that doesn't stick. And now your spear hand is deep behind enemy lines. Slim commits. Columns surge forward. The landscape changes. Less suffocating jungle, more scrub and dust, villages and fields, long lines of sight that feel almost alien after years of fighting in 10-yard visibility. The Japanese react with fury because they understand the threat. They throw units at Meiktila in repeated attacks, trying to cut the attackers off, trying to starve them, trying to do to Slim what they once did to everyone else. And here the old lesson returns, now weaponized. Being cut off is not a death sentence. Meiktila becomes a brutal, concentrated fight. Perimeters, strongpoints, airdrops, wounded evacuated under fire, ammunition counted like gold. Japanese assaults come in waves, sometimes at night, sometimes in daylight, with a kind of desperate courage that is terrifying to face. Slim's men hold because they've been trained to hold, because they believe supply will come from the air, because their commanders have been taught that panic is more lethal than bullets. The Japanese lose men they cannot replace. Their attacks burn hot and then begin to thin. Slim's gamble pays off. Central Burma starts to crack. Mandalay falls after hard fighting, and with it the sense that Japan can still dictate the terms of battle in this theater. But victory has a way of creating new danger. The faster Slim advances, the more he risks stretching his army into a long, vulnerable shape. The Japanese are retreating, yes, but retreating armies can still bite. And now the strategic pressure becomes almost unbearable. Rangoon. Rangoon is not just a city. It's a port, a supply artery, the key to feeding and fueling the entire campaign. If Rangoon isn't taken before the monsoon, 14th Army could win every battle and still be forced to stop. Stranded, undersupplied. In watching the rains erase roads and airfields alike, the monsoon isn't merely weather, it's an enemy with perfect timing. Slim feels the time limit tighten into something like a noose. So the plan becomes a race. Columns push south. Bridges are seized or rebuilt. Engineers work with a kind of exhausted ferocity, hands raw, faces hollow, because everyone knows what happens if the rains arrive first. Slim's headquarters becomes a place where maps are not just maps, they're predictions of hunger. And then comes another twist. Rangoon is taken not only by the land drive, but by an amphibious stroke, Operation Dracula, landing forces, moving in as the Japanese pull back. The city is secure just as the monsoon breaks, rain hammering down like a verdict. The timing is so tight it feels unreal, as if the campaign has been balanced on the edge of a knife and somehow didn't fall. For Slim, it's not triumph in the cinematic sense. It's relief mixed with grief. 14th Army has done what it was told was impossible. It has absorbed the worst defeat, rebuilt itself, stopped Japan at the gates of India, and then driven all the way back through Burma to the sea. But the cost is everywhere. In the missing faces, in the exhausted survivors, in the quiet way men look older than they should. And Slim's real achievement, the one that doesn't fit neatly into a medal citation, is that he has changed what his army believes about itself. He has taken a force that once feared the jungle like a curse and turned it into an instrument that could operate inside that curse and still win. He is not a glamorous commander. He doesn't sell war as adventure. He sells it as responsibility. He visits units, listens, speaks plainly, and insists on standards that save lives, anti-malarial discipline, proper supply, realistic training, because he has seen what happens when an army treats those things as optional. In his world, morale is not a slogan. It's the result of competence. By 1945, the Japanese in Burma are shattered, many dying not in set-piece battles but in the long, starving retreat through country that no longer offers them sanctuary. The war in Europe ends and the global spotlight swings away as if this entire campaign has been a side corridor of history. The men of 14th Army feel it in their bones. They have fought one of the hardest campaigns of the war, and they are still, somehow, the forgotten ones. Slim doesn't complain. He keeps working. Because even as Burma is secured, the larger war against Japan is still alive, and plans are already being discussed for further operations. New landings, new advances, new risks. Slim's army is exhausted, but it is also experienced in a way few forces on Earth can match. He is preparing for what comes next when the world changes in a flash. Japan surrenders after the atomic bombs and the Soviet entry into the war. The fighting stops, but Slim's burden doesn't. Now comes the strange, heavy work of ending a war properly, reorganizing, repatriating, stabilizing. The battlefield doesn't vanish when the shooting ends. It lingers in disease, in displaced people, in broken infrastructure, in the psychological wreckage carried by men who have lived too long under pressure. And Slim, who has always understood that war is as much about minds as maps, watches his army exhale. He has won his campaign. He has beaten a formidable enemy in the environment that enemy once owned. He has done it while fighting not only Japan, but time, terrain, sickness, and the corrosive belief that defeat was inevitable. And yet, even now, there's a final tension humming under the surface, because the world that 14th Army fought to preserve is already changing shape, and Slim's next battle will not be against an enemy in the jungle. It will be against the aftershocks of victory itself. The guns fall silent, and for a moment it feels like the jungle itself is listening, waiting to see what kind of man William Slim will be when there's no enemy left to outthink, because war gave him a simple equation: survive today, win tomorrow. Peace is messier. Peace asks different questions, and it asks them in a voice you can't shoot at. What do you do with an army that has been living on adrenaline and discipline for years? What do you do with men who have learned to measure life in rations, quinine tablets, and the distance to the next river? And what do you do when the world you fought for starts slipping out of your hands anyway? Slim's first post-war reality is not a parade. It's administration, hard, unglamorous, and urgent. The 14th Army has to be demobilized, redeployed, and in many cases simply brought home without letting the whole structure collapse into chaos. There are prisoners to recover, supplies to account for, units to disband, and a region still raw from occupation and fighting. The war is over, but the consequences are everywhere. Disease, hunger, shattered transport, and the kind of exhaustion that makes men reckless. He is promoted, honored, praised, yet the praise comes with a strange hollowness. The Burma campaign, one of the most punishing and decisive in the East, is already being pushed to the margins of public memory. Europe had the headlines. The atomic bombs have the shock. Slim's victory is the kind that looks from a distance like a line on a map. Up close, it was a million small decisions that kept men alive. And then the next conflict arrives, not with artillery, but with politics. Britain is changing. India is changing faster. The empire that once seemed permanent is now on a timer, and the timer is loud. Slim is sent into roles where the enemy is no longer a uniform force across a river, but instability, resentment, and the dangerous vacuum that appears when old authority withdraws and new authority hasn't fully formed. In 1948, he becomes chief of the Imperial General Staff, the professional head of the British Army. It is one of the highest posts a soldier can hold, and it drops him into a Britain that is broke, tired, and trying to redefine itself. The country is still rationing. The public wants peace dividends. The government wants to cut costs. The world, meanwhile, is not cooperating. The Cold War is hardening, crises are flaring, and Britain's commitments are still scattered. Across the globe, like a legacy bill that keeps coming due, Slim's real opponent now is the same thing he fought in Burma, only wearing a suit: the gap between what you want to do and what you can actually supply. In the jungle, that gap killed men. In Whitehall, it can kill readiness, credibility, and the lives of soldiers sent into the next emergency with too little and too late. He argues for realism. He pushes for an army that matches the nation's means, not its nostalgia. He understands morale at the strategic level the same way he understood it in a battalion. You cannot bluff your way through shortages forever. You can't ask soldiers to perform miracles as a policy. And yet he is also a man of the institution. He believes in standards, in professionalism, in the quiet dignity of doing the job properly, even when the job is politically inconvenient. That makes him respected and sometimes isolated. Because the post-war years are full of people selling certainty, Slim sells something harder: limits. In 1952, after decades of service that began with a young man clawing his way up from modest beginnings, he is elevated to the peerage. As Viscount Slim of Yarralumla and Bishopston, the title sounds like a victory lap. It isn't. It's a marker that the soldier who once lay wounded in Mesopotamia, who once watched an army collapse in Burma, has become a symbol. Ça peut determine whether he wants to be or not. Then comes the twist that would have sounded absurd to the young officer sweating in the trenches of the First World War. Slim is sent to the other side of the world to become Governor General of Australia. Australia, a country that had fought under British command, bled in imperial wars, and now is stepping into a more independent identity. The Governor General is the king's representative, ceremonial on paper, but deeply symbolic in a nation negotiating what it is and what it will become. Slim arrives in 1953, and he does not arrive as a distant aristocrat. He arrives as a soldier who knows what ordinary people look like when they're tired, when they're proud, when they're skeptical of grand talk. He and his wife Aileen become widely liked. Slim has a plain manner that cuts through pomp. He speaks directly, he listens. He treats veterans not as props, but as men whose memories still wake them at night. He understands the particular bond Australia has with its soldiers, and he doesn't try to borrow that bond for himself. He respects it. But even here, the clock is still ticking. Not the monsoon this time, age. Slim is in his 60s now. The body that carried him through malaria zones and command stress is not invincible. The years of strain, physical and mental, have a way of collecting interest. He keeps working, keeps traveling, keeps showing up, because that is what he has always done. He shows up. Yet the sense of limited time begins to sharpen everything. There is less patience for nonsense, less appetite for vanity. He has seen too many men die for illusions. His term in Australia lasts until 1960. By then, the world is unmistakably different from the one he fought to preserve. The empire is receding. New alliances are forming. Old certainties are gone. Slim returns to Britain with honors, but also with the quiet knowledge that the stage he once commanded, the vast imperial war machine, no longer exists in the same way. And now at last he does something that becomes its own kind of battle. He writes. His memoir, Defeat into Victory, is not a self-congratulatory monument. It is a clear-eyed account of how an army that had been broken was rebuilt, and how a campaign that many dismissed became a masterpiece of operational art and human management. Slim doesn't write like a man polishing metals. He writes like a man trying to tell the truth before time erases it. He describes mistakes. He describes fear. He describes the brutal arithmetic of supply and sickness. He makes it painfully clear that leadership is not a pose. It is a series of decisions that either reduce suffering or multiply it. He gives credit generously, especially to the Indian Army and to the ordinary soldiers who carried the weight. And in doing so, he quietly corrects the record of a war that often treated the Burma front as an afterthought. The book lands with force among soldiers and historians because it contains something rare. A commander admitting that morale is built. I had not wished for. That victory is engineered, not manifested. It becomes a classic not because it is dramatic, but because it is honest. And because the honesty is dramatic enough. Yet even as his reputation grows, Slim remains in a strange way underestimated by the wider public. He doesn't fit the popular mold. He isn't a headline hunter. He isn't a theatrical genius with a signature outfit. He is a man who learned painfully that the difference between a good plan and a dead army is whether you can feed it, move it, and keep it healthy. That kind of genius is harder to romanticize. It is also the kind that wins wars. In 1967, he is appointed a Knight of the Garter, one of the highest honors in Britain. The ceremony is ancient, almost medieval in its symbolism. Velvet, ritual, history pressing down from the walls. And there is Slim, the son of a Birmingham family, a man who once had to fight for every step upward, standing inside the oldest machinery of prestige in the country. It's a striking image, but the more striking truth is what he carried into that room. The memory of men in Burma, barefoot in mud, swallowing anti-malarial pills under a sergeant's glare, hauling ammunition through rain so thick it felt like drowning. If Slim has a crown, it is made of those memories. His final years are quieter, but not empty. He remains a figure soldiers seek out, a voice people trust because it never learned to lie smoothly. He watches the world continue to shift. New wars, new politics, New arguments about what the last war meant. He cannot control the arguments. He can only leave behind the record of what he did and how he did it. And then in December 1970, William Slim dies. No last-minute dramatic flourish. No cinematic ending. Just the closing of a life that had been lived under pressure for so long that pressure became its natural climate. But his legacy doesn't sit in statues. It sits in a hard lesson that armies keep relearning the expensive way. That leadership is not charisma. It is competence plus care. That morale is not a speech. It is food arriving on time, wounded men evacuated, malaria prevented, plans that make sense to the private carrying the rifle. That an army can be defeated and still be rebuilt if someone is willing to tell it the truth and then do the work. He fought Japan, yes. He fought terrain, disease, and time. But his most enduring fight was against despair, the contagious belief that failure is fate. In Burma, he proved it wasn't. And in the years after, as the world he served transformed beyond recognition, that may be the most valuable thing he left behind. Not an empire preserved, not a map colored the same way, but a model of command that treats human beings as the center of the machine. Because without them, the machine is just metal in the rain.